She couldn't see, not because of darkness, but because of the sack pulled over her head, coarse burlap that scraped her skin raw with every jolt of the wagon. They didn't let her walk. They didn't ask her name. They tossed her in like livestock, like weight, like a thing. Nora had screamed once. Just once. A cry ripped from her lungs that cost her a cracked rib and a warning that more pain would follow if she made another sound. So she went quiet, not out of fear, but out of survival. And isn't that how many of us learn to endure? By going silent. By folding in, hoping the world will look away before it destroys what's left of us. No one knew her face under that sack, and that's how they liked it. One of the men even said, she'd be easier to sell that way, less trouble. As if removing her identity also removed her power. But Nora was trouble. She was fire cloaked in dust. Even in that moment, bound, bruised, nameless, there was something burning inside her that hadn't been put out. They brought her to a place that stank of old tobacco, sweat, and sun-scorched cruelty. An auction yard, somewhere forgotten. Somewhere west, a place that traded in human lives like they were sacks of grain. The crowd laughed. One man shouted, "Hope she ain't cross-eyed." They didn't even remove the sack before putting a price on her, $15. Then 20, 25, and then one voice said, "I'll take her for 30, if she stays quiet." $30. That was the going rate for silence. But just as the auctioneer raised his gavel, ready to seal her fate, a voice cut through. The heat like a blade. "That's my wife." And everything stopped. Nora couldn't see who said it, but every part of her body turned toward the sound. The gavel froze mid-air. The crowd shifted. "Then take the sack off her head," the voice sighed. "She don't belong here." And then the sack was gone. The sunlight stabbed her eyes, the faces around her blurred. But one man stepped forward, tall, lean, dust on his coat, rage in his eyes. "I said," he repeated slowly, "she's my wife." The crowd laughed, but the man didn't flinch. Not when they questioned his claim. Not when they pointed out that she didn't recognize him. He just said, "She's been through hell." Doesn't change who she is. Nora looked at him. She had never seen him before in her life. But something in his voice didn't feel like performance. It felt like safety, like defiance, like truth dressed as a lie. And so she did something she hadn't done since they took her. She nodded, just once, and whispered, "Yes, I'm his." She didn't know why she said it. Maybe she did. Maybe because the alternative was another ride in that wagon, another cracked rib, another day as property. And maybe, just maybe, because for the first time in a long time, someone had stood for her. The auctioneer growled, "Papers are proof, mister." But the man didn't blink. "You want papers?" he said. "I'll bring you the man who forged the ones that put her here. He's in this crowd. I'd bet on it." The crowd shifted again. Nervous now. That kind of certainty carries weight, whether it's real or not. Sometimes the truth doesn't need to be true. It just needs to sound like it is. Nora's heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea who this man was, why he chose to speak, or what would happen next. But he didn't look away, not from her bruises, not from her rope burns, not from the shame wrapped around her like a second skin. Finally, the auctioneer raised his hands. "Fine, take her. But if you're lying, I won't stop the sheriff from doing what he has to." The man nodded, calm, steady, tossed a few coins to the ground. Then, "Consider this my last bid." He walked to her, slow and deliberate, and knelt to cut the rope around her ankles. She could barely stand, but when he looked at her and asked, "Can you walk?" she swallowed and said, "Yes." He didn't touch her, didn't claim her, just stepped aside and said, "Then let's go." They walked away together through the crowd, like a match walking through dry grass, and no one stopped them. Maybe they were afraid. Maybe they were stunned. Maybe they thought she'd scream. But she didn't. Nora just walked. Head high, as high as the pain would let her. Would you have nodded like Nora did? Would you have trusted the voice of a stranger over the silence of captivity? Because sometimes freedom doesn't come wrapped in certainty. Sometimes it comes wrapped in risk, in defiance, in a stranger's voice daring to say, "She's not for sale." And that's where her story really begins. Not in the auction, not in the sack, but in the moment she chose to step into the lie, because that lie was the first true thing anyone had given her in a long, long time. They didn't speak much at first. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was heavy. The kind that settles in when two people carry more history than they can say out loud. The kind of silence you don't interrupt because it's doing the work of healing before words even begin. Nora sat in the wagon beside the man who had lied to save her. She didn't know his name yet, only that when he said she was his wife, the world had paused just long enough for her to escape. Now miles away from the auction yard, from the laughter and the gavel and the hands that had pulled at her as if she were inventory. The sack was gone, the ropes were off. But freedom, real freedom, was still a question. Eventually, the man spoke. He told her his name was Dean, just that. No last name, no explanations. And then quietly he said, "They took my sister when I was a boy. Sold her like they tried to sell you." That sentence alone explained everything. The silence, the fire in his eyes, the steadiness in his hands. He hadn't rescued her because he thought she was special. He had stepped in because once he was too small to stop what happened to someone he loved. Nora didn't reply at first. What do you even say to that? Thank you? I'm sorry? She'd learned long ago that some wounds don't want comfort. They want witness. He pointed to the trail winding off the main road. "I built a place," he said, "for her, in case she ever came back." They walked the last mile on foot, through tall cottonwoods and brush that hadn't been tamed. At the end of that trail, standing against the slope of a hill, was a small wooden cabin. Nothing fancy, one room. A porch with creaky planks. A slanted roof that had survived more storms than it should have. "This was meant for her," he said, opening the door. "But now it's yours, if you want it." It's strange, isn't it? How something so small, a roof, a voice, that says you can stay, can feel like the world shifting back into place. Not because it solves everything, but because it asks nothing. Dean didn't tell her what she owed. He didn't look at her like a burden. He just opened the door and stepped aside. That night, Nora sat on the edge of the cot, staring at her hands. The bruises still dark, the skin still raw, but her fingers were her own again. The room smelled of cedar and old ash. There was a cup on the shelf, a spoon, a Bible that hadn't been touched in years. Everything was simple, unremarkable. But it was clean. And it was hers. "You're not going to lock the door behind me?" she asked, not looking at him. "No," Dean said. "But if you want to lock it yourself, the bar's leaning by the window." That answer stunned her more than any kindness ever had, because trust was not a language she remembered. Trust had always come with strings, with debt, with expectation. But here was a man who had given her nothing but space. Later, as he lit a fire and stirred stew from the cellar, she whispered, "I don't know how to trust this." "You don't have to," he said. "Not now. Just eat, rest, heal. That's enough." And it was it didn't feel like a grand moment. It wasn't dramatic, but sometimes the smallest mercies are the ones that cut deepest. A warm meal. A door left unlocked. A voice that doesn't ask questions when you're too tired to answer them. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't even know if she'd stay. But that night, she slept not from exhaustion, but from the quiet miracle of being safe. And maybe that's where real freedom begins, not in the breaking of chains, but in the absence of fear. In being seen not as someone broken, but as someone becoming. And for the first time in a very long time, Nora began to believe that. Who she had been wasn't the end of her story. Just the beginning of something else, something hers. There's something sacred about doing work with your own hands. Especially when, for a long time, your hands didn't belong to you. When every movement was dictated, every task demanded, and every bruise left behind said, "You are not yours." In that quiet cabin, tucked behind a wall of cottonwoods and sky, Nora's hands began to remember who they belonged to. Dn. He didn't hover. He didn't give orders. He didn't even offer comfort the way people usually do with soft words and heavy glances. Instead, he gave her something harder to come by: space. He handed her a hatchet one morning without a word and pointed to the kindling pile. No expectations, no tests. Just a simple, silent question. "Do you want to try?" Her arms shook. The axe was heavier than she expected. The wood splintered unevenly beneath her first swing. But each crack of timber was a sound she'd almost forgotten, the sound of strength not taken, but returned. And that's how it began, not with a dramatic rebirth or sweeping transformation, but with small tasks. Chopping wood, stirring stew, scrubbing pots, clearing brush from the garden. With every blister and ache, she wasn't being punished anymore. She was rebuilding. Work became ritual. Not a burden, but a form of prayer. Her body, once controlled and silenced, became her own language again. Every stretch of her shoulders, every callus that formed along her palms, said, "I survived." Not just survive, but began to live on her terms. She didn't ask permission, and she didn't owe thanks. That was the quiet agreement between her and Dean. He offered her the tools, and she decided what to build. Sometimes they worked side by side in silence. He would tend the fence or repair the roof. She'd knead dough or sweep the porch. No one asked the other to explain where they came from or what haunted them at night. It was enough to share the daylight without fear. And slowly, in the rhythm of that shared labor, something rare grew: dignity. There's a common mistake people make when they talk about healing. They picture it as soft, gentle, like a whisper. But sometimes healing looks like sweat, like splinters in your thumbs, like sore muscles and burnt bread, and learning how to plant something and wait for it to grow. That's what it was for Nora. She didn't need to be saved. She needed to feel herself choose again. To hammer a nail and know it would stay where she placed it. To taste something she'd cooked and feel pride, not obligation. To sit under the weight of a day's work and think, "This is mine. I made this." And maybe that's where power really begins, not in what we demand from the world, but in what we reclaim, piece by piece, with our own bare hands. She didn't come back to that town because she had to. She came back because she could. That alone made all the difference. Nora sat upright on the wagon seat beside Dean, her hands steady in her lap, her chin lifted just enough to meet the world. Head on. This was the same road, the same dust, the same wooden post where they'd tried to sell her like a mule. But something had shifted. The town hadn't changed, but she had. The first time she'd been here, a sack covered her face. She was voiceless, nameless, priced like a tool. Now her hair was braided tight, her sleeves rolled from honest work, and her presence said what words didn't need to. "I am not yours anymore." Heads turned as the wagon rolled into town. Eyes narrowed. Whispers passed between lips too afraid to speak too loud. But no one called out. No one laughed. They couldn't. Not with the way she walked. Not with the way Dean stood beside her, not claiming her, not shielding her, but standing as her equal. At the general store, she asked for thread. "Not black," she said. "Not mourning fabric. Something for mending. Something that felt like living." The shopkeeper didn't know what to say. People rarely do when faced with someone they once dehumanized, who now looks them in the eye with no apology. Afterwards, as they loaded supplies into the wagon, Dean handed her a small wrapped parcel. She opened it slowly. Inside was a silver comb, simple, solid, not flashy, not delicate, just real. Why? She asked. He looked at her with that quiet, grounded calm she'd come to recognize. Because today, he said, you walked into town without fear. That deserves something. And isn't that the truth? We talk about healing like it's invisible, like it lives only in private journals or quiet prayers. But sometimes healing looks like walking back into the place where they tried to break you and letting them see that they didn't. Sometimes it looks like standing still while others shrink away. Sometimes it's the silence of dignity in a place once full of shame. Nora didn't need the town's approval. She didn't need their forgiveness. What she needed, what she claimed, was her right to exist in that space with her head high. And by doing so, she became more than a survivor. She became a mirror, a reckoning, a reminder that the past does not have the final word unless you let it. The silver comb wasn't just a gift, it was a symbol of every thread she'd stitched back into herself, of every moment she'd chosen to rise instead of retreat. She didn't need it to feel strong, but it honored the fact that she was. And if you've ever walked into a place that once made you feel small and walked out feeling whole, you know what that means. You know that freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just walks back in, quiet, unshaken, whole. Some ghosts don't wait until you're ready. They come back uninvited, wearing new clothes but carrying the same threat. This one rode up the trail on a well-fed horse, boots polished, grin too sharp. His name was Lael, but he wasn't there to introduce himself. He came to collect. Nora had been hauling water from the stream when she saw the dust rising in the distance. One hand on the bucket, one eye on the path. She didn't call for Dean. She didn't flinch. Some part of her already knew why he'd come. There's a look men wear when they think they still own you. He didn't bother with pleasantries. Just leaned forward in his saddle and said, "This the Ward place?" She gave him nothing but a single nod. "I work for a man," Lyle continued, "who remembers you, says you left owing him something, claims he paid good money." Nora stood straight, the sun warm on her shoulders. "He bought silence, obedience. A girl with no choices," she said. "None of that's for sale anymore." That stopped him, just for a beat. Not because he didn't expect resistance, but because he didn't expect clarity. Women like her weren't supposed to speak that way. Not with steel in their voice. Not with their feet planted in the soil like they belonged. "Brave talk," Lyle said, his voice slipping into threat. "You think that cowboy can protect you forever?" She didn't even glance toward the garden, where Dean was just now setting down his hoe. She looked Leal in the eye and said, "He didn't save me, I did that." And that was the truth. It's easy to assume that someone else is the hero of a story like hers. That the man who cut the rope or offered the cabin is the one who made her free. But real freedom doesn't come from being rescued. It comes from refusing to return to the cage. Dean appeared at her side then, quiet, calm, not stepping in front of her, standing just behind. His presence was a wall, but not a shield. She didn't need defending, just room to speak. "You're trespassing," he said flatly. "And if you're threatening her, you're not leaving with your boots." Lyle looked between them, measuring odds. But it was Nora who stepped forward, forcing his eyes back to hers. "Tell your boss," she said. "If he wants something from me, he can come ask himself. But I won't be gagged, leashed, or covered again. I know who I am now." He tried to play it cool, tugged his reins, gave one last empty warning. "You'll regret talking like that." She didn't blink. "No," she said. "I regret not saying it sooner." And just like that, he turned and rode away, leaving behind nothing but the dust and the weight of his failure. Later, as they sat on the porch watching the sun begin to fall behind the trees, Dean looked at her and said, "You didn't need me." And she nodded. "Not this time. I just needed you to stand behind me. Not in front." There's something powerful in that shift. From being protected to protecting yourself. From waiting for rescue to writing your own answer. Nora had become the kind of woman who not only stood her ground, but stood it for others. And in a world that had once tried to unname her, that alone was a kind of revolution. It happened on a quiet afternoon, the kind of day where everything feels ordinary until it doesn't. Nora and Dean had returned to town for supplies. Rope, sugar, a new blade for the plow. The usual. There was no drama in the air, just sunlight. And dust. The same auction post still stood near the edge of town, weathered but stubborn. Like a scar no one wanted to admit was still fresh. Then came the shouting. A man was dragging the girl barely 16, if that by the arm. She didn't scream. She didn't resist. She moved the way people do when resistance has been punished too many times. Limp, silent, hollowed out. Nora didn't pause. She didn't ask Dean what to do. She didn't wait for anyone to step in. Because she knew that silence had worn it like a second skin. And she knew what it cost to be pulled into the dark while the world looked away. She stepped between them, voice flat but unwavering. "That girl's not yours." The man scoffed. "You think she wants your kind of help?" Nora didn't blink. "I don't think," she said. "I remember." She turned to the girl. "Do you want to leave?" There was a pause long enough to feel like a lifetime. The girl's lips trembled. Then she nodded, just once, so softly you could miss it if you weren't watching like your life depended on it. The man lunged, but Dean was already there, standing beside Nora with a calm that felt like thunder held in a closed fist. "You'll want to think twice," he said, hand hovering near his belt. A deputy stepped out from the saloon, chewing slow, watching the scene unfold. "Everything all right here?" Nora didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She just said, "She's not his." The girl clung to her now, breath shallow, eyes wide. And that deputy, for whatever reason, maybe the law, maybe the fear, maybe the truth in Nora's tone, looked at the man and said, "Then she walks away, and you ride out." And that was it. One moment, one voice. One girl no longer for sale. Back. At the cabin, the girl's name was Anna. She didn't speak much. But she chopped carrots, fetched water. Watched Nora like she was something impossible, like maybe strength was something you could learn just by being near it, and maybe it was. Because here's the thing most people don't realize. Healing doesn't just stop with you. When you reclaim your voice, it echoes. When you stand tall, someone else might see how to follow. And when you refuse to be silenced again, you don't just save yourself, you help dismantle the system that tried to erase you in the first place. Nora didn't rescue Anna with fire or fists. She rescued her with something quieter. She used the very thing they once tried to steal from her, her voice. A voice that once begged, once cracked under fear, now steady as stone. And maybe that's what power looks like. Not in the size of your body, not in the loudness of your words, but in the moment you say no more and mean it, not just for yourself, but for the girl next in line. That day, something shifted, not just for Anna, but for Nora too. Because in helping another, she proved to herself that she was no longer just surviving. She was leading. She was becoming. There's something powerful about building a life you weren't supposed to have. Not inherited, not rescued, not handed to you, but built, plank by plank, with your own bruised hands. For Nora, that life didn't come with a title or a ceremony. It came with sweat on her brow and dirt beneath her fingernails. Every nail she hammered into the walls of that cabin was a line rewritten in her story. The roof she patched, it kept her dry, but more than that, it proved she could keep herself safe. The curtains she stitched from old grain sacks, not fancy but soft and chosen. For once, softness wasn't weakness, it was hers. And the meals she cooked, simple bread, stew from what they grew or caught, weren't just food. They were memory, control, and the quiet pride That comes from making something that stays yours after the day ends. This wasn't a life of luxury. The cabin creaked in the wind. The garden sometimes gave more weeds than vegetables. But it was real, honest, and every inch of it was made, not taken. One afternoon, a neighbor named Mabel came by. She was older, sharp-eyed, the kind of woman who noticed more than she let on. She'd heard stories people always talk when a woman who was once silenced begins to live too loudly for their comfort. Over a cup of tea, Mabel asked the question others had whispered behind closed doors. "So, are you two married?" Nora didn't look to Dean for the answer. She didn't stammer or explain. She simply said, "We're building something. Whether it has a name or not, it's real." That was the truth. And in a world that had tried so hard to define her by labels slave, girl, property, problem, choosing not to name it was, in itself, a kind of rebellion. Because what she had wasn't defined by someone else's permission. It was built on presence, on respect, on shared silence and earned trust. And that kind of love, if you want to call it, that wasn't loud. It didn't shout or claim. It stood quietly in the corner, holding space for her to be whoever she needed to be that day. You see, the world often teaches women to wait. Wait to be chosen. Wait to be given a name. Wait to be told what their life is worth. But Nora didn't wait anymore. She claimed, she created. She chose. And in doing so, she taught us something simple but profound, that the truest kind of home is not the one you're born into or the one you're given. It's the one you build with your own hands and fill with your own breath, even if it leaks when it rains, even if the floorboards creak, even if it doesn't come with a certificate. Because when it's real, you feel it in your bones. And that's enough. Sometimes change doesn't begin with a speech or a protest. Sometimes it starts in silence. In the quiet decision of one person to say no, not loudly, not with an army behind them, but with the weight of everything they've endured and the courage to refuse more. That's how it happened. Not because lawmakers grew a conscience, not because crowds filled the streets, but because too many women, like Nora, stood up, one by one, in different corners of the world. In kitchens and fields, in cabins tucked behind forgotten roads. They stood, they spoke, they stayed. And that ripple turned into a shift. A new law was passed. Human auctions, those places where dignity was stripped, where names were erased, were no longer legal. Not because history had suddenly become moral, but because it was forced to look itself in the mirror. Word reached Nora days later, carried in the hands of her neighbor, Mabel, the same woman who once asked if she and Dean were married. Now, walking up the porch with fresh bread and sharp eyes. "They talk about you in town," Mabel said, placing the loaf down. "Say you started something." Nora just smiled. The kind of smile that comes after surviving more than you ever thought you could. "I didn't start it," she said. "I just refused to be ended." And that was the truth. She hadn't asked to be a symbol. She didn't plan to inspire change. She only knew what she could no longer allow to be erased, to be sold, to be forgotten while still breathing. That afternoon, Dean carved a new sign for the gate. Nothing fancy. Just a wooden plank, letters etched by steady hands. It read, "The Ward Place Home of the Woman Who Wasn't Bought." Nora stood in front of it for a long time, fingers grazing the grooves in the wood, not crying, just breathing, taking in the strange, quiet power of being seen for exactly who you are on your terms. And this is what's worth remembering. Her story didn't start with freedom. It started with a sack over her head, a cracked rib, and a crowd that laughed, while she was priced like cattle. But the moment it truly began, the moment it shifted, was when a stranger lied and said, "She's my wife," and Nora chose to say, "Yes." That lie wasn't about marriage. It was about reclaiming a voice. And over time, that voice led her somewhere truer, Because in the end, Nora was never really his. She was hers. And in a world that tried so hard to define her, own her, control her, she gave herself the only name that mattered. I am my own. Let that sit with you for a second. How often are we taught to wait for permission to matter? To wait for someone to name us, to love us, to prove we belong. But maybe it's the other way around. Maybe the most radical thing we can do is choose ourselves. Choose to stay, to build. To protect not just our own freedom, but the space where others can find theirs too. That's what Nora did. She didn't burn the system down. She simply refused to kneel to it. And that refusal, repeated enough times, became a revolution. Years from now, they'll tell her story in different ways. Some will begin with the sack, others with the silver comb. But the ones who understand will start where it really matters. Not with "she was bought," but with "she stood up" and never sat down again. If this story moved you, share it. It made you think, leave a comment. And if you're ready for more, subscribe.